The metallic glint caught Scott's eye long before he recognized what it was. As he stepped closer, the muted crunch of pine needles underfoot was swallowed by the stillness of the early morning air. The sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting a dappled light on the scene before him. He crouched down, pushing aside the fallen branches that obscured the object, a rusting sedan, long forgotten, its body nearly swallowed by the forest floor. His heart quickened as he traced the outline of the car, its faded paint barely discernible beneath layers of dirt and time. The windshield was cracked, spider-webbed like the memories Scott had buried deep in his own heart. He reached for the door handle, cold and unyielding, and with a firm pull, the door creaked open, revealing an interior shrouded in shadow. The musty odor wafted out, tinged with the metallic scent of decay, a reminder of stories long left untold. Inside, the dim light revealed a disarray of old maps marked with ink, their edges curled and yellowed with age. They were a testament to adventures once dreamed but never realized. A woman's coat, heavy and dark, lay crumpled in the back seat as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. But it was the stack of missing person reports that made his heart race. A collection of papers, all pointing to the same woman, vanished from the nearby town over 2 decades ago. Names lost to time, but the pain of their absence lingered, like the scent of damp earth after a rain. Scott rifled through the glove compartment, his fingers brushing against something cold and hard. He pulled out a cassette tape, its label faded, but the date unmistakable. The very day local newspapers reported her disappearance. The fragile plastic felt like a portal to the past, holding secrets that had long been forgotten. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as he stood in the quiet embrace of the woods. The echoes of the forest surrounded him, whispers of the lives that had intersected in this place. What had happened to her? He could almost hear her laughter, the sound of a life cut short, a promise left unfulfilled. That thought lingered, heavy in the air, as he realized that this discovery could lead to answers or to deeper questions he wasn't ready to face. Scott's heart raced as he weighed the significance of what he had stumbled upon. The forest had always felt like a refuge, a place of solace where life moved at its own pace. But now it felt different, charged, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for him to decide what to do with the truth he unearthed. Would he let it lie dormant, hidden from the world beneath the cover of trees? Or would he dare to uncover the shadows that lurked within, risking everything he thought he knew? As he stepped back from the car, the air thickened with anticipation, and he felt the forest watch, every rustle and whisper echoing in his mind. The journey ahead loomed daunting and uncertain. Scott woke up the next morning to the sound of rain tapping softly against his window, a comforting rhythm that mingled with the scent of wet earth. The familiar sight of his small kitchen, with its worn linoleum and chipped coffee mug bearing the faded logo of a local diner, felt like a warm embrace. Yet beneath the surface, an uncomfortable tension simmered, gnawing at his insides like the chill of the morning air. He brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the room, and glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:15 a.m. He had always found solace in the predictability of his morning routine. A slice of toast, a brief glance at the newspaper, and a quiet moment to gather his thoughts before heading into the day. But today was different. Today, the shadow of the woman from the car loomed large in his mind. As he prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the kitchen window. His brown hair was tousled, and the stubble on his chin suggested a few days of neglect, but it was not his appearance that troubled him. It was the weight pressing against his conscience. The missing woman, her life reduced to reports and faded photographs, haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had a responsibility to uncover the truth. Arriving at the garage, he was greeted by the familiar sounds of engines revving and the chatter of customers. Old Joe, a regular, sat at the counter drinking coffee and reading the paper. Joe looked up, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Morning, Scott! You look like you've seen a ghost. You all right?" Scott forced a smile, his stomach in knots. "Just a rough night, I guess." He turned away, eager to escape the scrutinizing gaze of his co-workers. He poured himself a cup of coffee and headed towards the back, where the tools hung neatly on the wall, their metallic sheen catching the dim light. As he worked on a stubborn engine, his mind drifted back to the car in the woods. The memories of the woman's voice on the tape echoed in his head. She had spoken of trust, of escape, and of a ranger who promised to help. His heart raced as he recalled the stories of his uncle, a ranger known for his courage and integrity, who had patrolled these very woods years ago. "Scott!" came a voice from the front of the garage, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mike, his boss. "Can you help me out with this customer? They need a quick fix and I'm tied up." "Sure thing," Scott replied, forcing himself to focus. He wiped his hands on a rag and made his way to the front, trying to shake off the weight of his thoughts. The customer was a woman, her face familiar yet distant. She had always been a part of the town, having grown up just a few streets over from Scott. Her name was Lisa, and she was looking for help with her old sedan, an unfortunate reminder of a once vibrant life, now just another vehicle in need of repair. "What's going on, Lisa?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tumult within. "It's making a funny noise and I'm worried it might break down," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. "You know how old she is. Just like me, I guess." Scott chuckled lightly to ease the tension. "Don't worry, I'll take a look and see what we can do." As he worked, he overheard snippets of conversation from the other mechanics. Their discussion drifted to the missing woman, the same one whose papers he had found in the forest. "Did you hear about the new search efforts?" one mechanic said. "Yeah, they're bringing in volunteers." "It's been over 20 years, another replied, his tone heavy with sorrow. Scott's heart sank. He had hoped the town would have moved on, but the memory of her disappearance lingered like an uninvited guest. All day, the weight of the missing woman pressed on him, mingling with the scent of motor oil and gasoline. Each time the bell on the garage door chimed, announcing a new customer, he felt a renewed sense of urgency. What if someone came in with information that could lead to a breakthrough? What if someone recognized the name from the reports? But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he might be the only one who could connect the dots. After work, Scott drove to his parents' house, the familiar route winding through the quiet streets of Pine Hollow. The sky had cleared, leaving a crispness in the air that felt refreshing yet unsettling. He parked in the gravel driveway, the crunch of stones beneath his tires echoing loudly in the stillness. His mother greeted him with a warm smile, her apron dusted with flour from the day's baking. "Scott, it's good to see you." "Hey, Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thought I'd drop by." His father was in the living room watching the news. "They're still talking about that missing woman, huh?" he remarked, not bothering to glance up. "It's a damn shame." Scott felt his stomach twist. "Yeah, it is." They sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing easily around small-town gossip and local happenings. But the mention of the woman hung in the air like a dark cloud. "Do you remember when she disappeared?" Scott asked, almost hesitantly. His father paused, his fork hovering mid-air. "Vaguely. It was a long time ago, but I remember the town being shaken up about it. Everyone was worried. I think they even had search parties." Scott nodded, encouraging his father to continue. "What do you remember about the search?" His father shook his head, a flash of sadness crossing his face. "Just that people came from all over to help. But they didn't find anything. It was like she vanished into thin air." The weight of those words settled heavily on Scott's shoulders. He couldn't ignore the connection any longer. His uncle had been a ranger during that time. He must have known something. I was too young to understand back then, but I remember people saying she had been seen with someone in the woods, his father added, his voice trailing off. Who? Scott pressed, feeling a surge of urgency. Some said a ranger, but I wouldn't put much stock in it, just talk, you know. Scott's heart raced. The very ranger his uncle was, a man he revered, had potentially been tied to a tragedy that cast a long shadow over the town. The implications were staggering. Later that night, Scott returned home, the events of the day swirling in his mind. He sat in the dim light of his living room, the flickering glow of the television casting shadows on the walls. He couldn't focus on the show. His mind was consumed with thoughts of that cassette tape. Driven by an overwhelming urge, he pulled the tape from his pocket and placed it into the old recorder, the machine crackling to life with a hiss. The woman's voice emerged, trembling and uncertain. If you're listening to this, then I'm not where I thought I'd be. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. She spoke of escape, of someone she believed she could trust, and then, chillingly, she mentioned the ranger who promised to help. Scott's breath caught in his throat. His uncle had been the ranger who patrolled those woods, the same man who had told him countless stories of bravery. What had he promised, and who had he betrayed? The thought spun in his mind like a whirlwind. Days passed, and Scott could feel the tension in the air, a tightening grip around his heart. Each encounter with the locals became a reminder of the woman who never returned. Her absence was palpable in the shared glances, the hushed conversations. The townsfolk had moved on, but Scott couldn't. The voice on that tape echoed in his mind, an unfinished story, an unresolved mystery that needed to be told. The conversations at the garage turned to gossip, surrounding the renewed search efforts for the missing woman. Scott listened, his heart pounding as whispers of hope and despair filled the air. They say they might have new leads, one of the mechanics said. Some old maps showed places they hadn't searched before. That night, he found himself unable to sleep, tossing and turning as the images of the woman and the rusting sedan plagued his thoughts. What if he could find out more? What if the old maps revealed something vital he had to know? The following weekend, he decided to revisit the scene. The trees loomed over him, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as he walked deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. When he reached the sedan, he felt a rush of emotions. The car stood like a sentinel, a reminder of a life interrupted. He crouched down, careful to push aside the branches that had grown around it since his last visit. As he knelt before the vehicle, he felt the forest holding its breath, as if waiting for him to uncover its secrets. Pushing the door open once more, he peered inside. The musty smell wafted out again, but this time he was determined to search for clues. He rifled through the old maps once more, tracing the inked lines with his fingers. His heart raced as he stumbled upon a map marked with a circled area that bore the name Cedar Grove. Puzzled, Scott pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the map, determined to do some research back in town. He had never heard of Cedar Grove before, but the name felt important, like a thread he needed to follow. As he stood up, the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on the scene. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this journey would lead him to answers not just for himself, but for the family that had lost so much. As he walked back through the trees, he glanced over his shoulder at the sedan one last time, feeling the weight of history pressing against his back. The trees seemed to whisper encouragement, urging him onward. He was ready to confront the past, to piece together the fragments of a life lost, and to uncover the truth that had remained hidden for far too long. With each step, Scott felt the resolve growing stronger within him. He had a mission now, and with that came a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. No longer would he be a passive observer of the shadows that haunted Pine Hollow. He would uncover the light, and in doing so, perhaps he could bring closure to the community and to himself. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to follow it wherever it might lead, to find the missing pieces of a puzzle that had lingered, unsolved, for far too many years. The following days were filled with a mix of anxiety and determination as Scott prepared to uncover the truth behind Emily Carter's disappearance. With the photograph of the map he had found in the cabin, he felt an urgency that propelled him forward. Cedar Grove loomed large in his mind, and he needed to understand what had happened there. After work, Scott visited the local library, a modest building filled with well-worn books. The librarian, Miss Clara, greeted him with curiosity. "Cedar Grove? That's an old name. It was a popular camping spot years ago, but people stopped going there after—" Her voice trailed off, eyes clouded with memories. "After what?" Scott pressed, sensing the weight of history in her words. "After the disappearance," she replied softly. "There were rumors about the woods being haunted afterward. People said they could hear her cries in the wind." Determined to learn more, Scott asked if she could help him find records related to Cedar Grove. Miss Clara led him to the archives, pulling out a large book filled with old articles and photographs. Among them, Scott found a small mention of Emily's disappearance, her name emblazoned across the page. "Her name was Emily Carter," Miss Clara explained, pointing to a faded photograph of a young woman. "She was beloved in this community. Everyone was devastated when she went missing." Scott felt a heavy knot form in his stomach as he read the accounts of the search efforts that had followed her disappearance. The last sighting had been near Cedar Grove, where she had reportedly gone for a hike. Later that week, Scott decided to revisit Cedar Grove himself. He drove through the familiar winding roads, memories of childhood camping trips flooding his mind. As he parked at the entrance, the woods appeared both inviting and foreboding. Stepping out of his truck, Scott inhaled the scent of pine and damp earth, feeling an unsettling mix of nostalgia and dread. He followed the worn path deeper into the woods, each step resonating with purpose. After walking for what felt like hours, he stumbled upon a clearing that had once been a popular campsite. The remnants of fire rings and charred logs lay scattered about, yet nature had reclaimed the area. It was beautiful, but a sense of loss lingered. As dusk began to settle, Scott explored the area further. He discovered a small, weathered sign partially buried in the underbrush. It read Cedar Springs, pointing to a narrow trail diverging from the main path. Heart pounding, he decided to follow it. The air grew cooler as he trekked along the trail, the trees towering ominously overhead. Finally, the path opened into a clearing, revealing an old, dilapidated cabin. The sight struck him. This was where Emily had last been seen. As he approached, a mix of apprehension and excitement surged within him. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, remnants of furniture scattered about. Old newspapers littered the floor, and a headline caught his eye. "Search continues for missing woman. Family pleads for information." Reading the article sent chills down his spine. He felt the weight of Emily's story pressing in on him. Searching further, he rummaged through a drawer and found a silver locket, tarnished but still beautiful. Inside were two photographs, one of Emily and another of a man he didn't recognize. The inscription on the back read, "Always with you." Questions flooded Scott's mind. Who was this man? What connection did he have with Emily? The discovery was a tangible piece of her story, igniting a fire within him to uncover more. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Scott left the cabin, feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. The woods felt alive with secrets, urging him to dig deeper. The locket was a clue, and he was determined to find out more about the man in the photograph. Back in town, he returned to the diner, a hub for gossip and information. He approached Lisa, sharing his findings. "I found a locket that belonged to Emily, and I think it might lead to more answers." Lisa's eyes widened. "What did you find?" "I believe it might have belonged to her boyfriend, Tom." "Do you know how I can contact him?" Scott asked, his heart racing. "I remember Tom. They were in love. After Emily went missing, he was never the same. I think he moved to the city," Lisa replied, her voice filled with empathy. "Do you have any contact information?" Scott pressed, desperate for a way to connect with him. "I can try to reach out to some folks who might know," she offered. Scott left the diner that day filled with hope. Later, he received a call from Lisa, who had tracked down Tom's number. The moment felt pivotal, and Scott's heart raced as he prepared to reach out. That evening, he dialed the number, anxiety twisting in his stomach. "Hello? Tom, this is Scott. I'm looking for information about Emily Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. There was a brief pause. "Emily? Why are you looking for her?" Tom's voice was gravelly. "I found something that belongs to her. A locket. I think it might help piece together her story," Scott explained, sensing the gravity of the moment. Another pause followed. "What do you know?" Tom asked, his tone shifting. "I found old reports and a cassette tape Emily recorded before she went missing. There are clues that lead back to Cedar Grove, and I'm trying to understand what happened," Scott replied. Tom sighed heavily. "I don't know how much help I can be, but I owe it to her to try. I've carried this guilt for years." "Can we meet?" Scott asked, feeling the urgency of the moment. "Yeah, I'd like that. Can you meet me at the diner in town tomorrow?" Tom replied. "Absolutely," Scott responded, relief flooding him. The next day, he arrived at the diner early, anticipation coursing through his veins. Minutes later, Tom walked in, his demeanor weary yet curious. Scott waved him over, and they settled into a booth in the back corner. "Thanks for meeting me," Scott said, trying to gauge Tom's mood. "Emily, it's been so long. I've thought about her every single day," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "I found some things that might help us understand what happened. This locket was in the cabin where I think she last was," Scott explained, placing it on the table. Tom picked it up, his hands trembling. "I gave this to her. I thought it would keep her safe." "Do you remember anything about that day?" Scott pressed gently. Tom's expression darkened. "We were supposed to go hiking together, but she wanted to go alone. I didn't think it would be a big deal. I was working that day, and she didn't want to wait. I should have gone with her." "Do you remember anything strange? A person she might have mentioned?" Scott asked, noticing the guilt etched on Tom's face. Tom shook his head. "I didn't know she was in danger. We were going through a rough patch and she wanted space. I've always regretted not being there." "Was there anyone else in her life? Friends? Someone she confided in?" Scott inquired, eager for any lead. "There was Sarah," Tom said after a moment. "Emily and she were close. Maybe she knows more." Scott felt a sense of urgency. "I've spoken to Sarah. She mentioned you, but I'd like to hear more about your relationship with Emily." Tom took a deep breath. "We were happy at first, but things got complicated. I was dealing with my own issues, and I think she felt isolated. I never thought it would lead to this." "Did you ever see her with anyone else? Anyone who seemed suspicious?" Scott pressed, searching for a glimmer of insight. "No. She was just gone. One minute she was there and the next she wasn't." Tom replied, his voice breaking. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. Scott could feel the urgency to dig deeper. Is there anything else you remember? Any small detail? Tom looked thoughtful, then nodded. She mentioned going to Cedar Grove. I told her it wasn't safe alone, but she wanted to see the spring. It was her favorite spot. Cedar Springs, Scott clarified, recalling the sign he had found. Yeah, she loved that place. I guess she thought it would be peaceful, Tom said, his eyes filled with regret. Scott leaned forward, determination igniting within him. I need to go back there. I think there's more to discover. Tom nodded, the sadness still present in his eyes, but replaced by a hint of hope. I'll come with you. If there's anything to find, I want to be there. As they left the diner, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. Scott felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and with Tom at his side, they would uncover the truth together. The next day, they made their way back to Cedar Grove, the air thick with anticipation. Scott felt the weight of Emily's story pressing down on them, urging them forward as they ventured deeper into the woods. Arriving at Cedar Springs, they found the area just as Scott had remembered it, the beauty twinged by a sense of loss. They stood in the clearing, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves echoing the quiet tension between them. This was her favorite spot, Tom murmured, looking around. I wish I had gone with her. Scott felt the urgency of their mission. Let's search the area. We need to understand what happened here. Together, they began to explore the clearing, searching for any signs of Emily. Every rustle of leaves felt significant, every shadow a potential clue. Scott's heart raced with anticipation, knowing they were close to uncovering the truth. As they combed through the underbrush, Scott spotted something glinting in the dirt. He bent down, brushing away the leaves to reveal a small silver bracelet, one he recognized instantly. It was Emily's, adorned with delicate charms. Tom, look, Scott called, holding it up for him to see. This was hers. Tom's face paled as he took a step closer. Where did you find that? Right here, in the clearing, Scott replied, feeling a chill run through him. The discovery felt heavy, a burden of unanswered questions. We need to report this, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. Not yet, Scott replied, feeling conflicted. I think we need to keep looking. There could be more. Tom nodded, determination hardening his features. Okay, let's see what else we can find. As they continued to search, the tension in the air thickened. Scott felt the weight of the woods pressing down on them, as if the trees were witnesses to the events that had unfolded here. They moved cautiously, the silence around them echoing with unspoken fears. Just as they were about to give in to the weight of despair, Scott caught sight of something further down the path, another clearing, partially obscured by underbrush. He motioned for Tom to follow, and together they made their way toward the new area. What they found left them both breathless. A small makeshift camp, remnants of a firing surrounded by stone, and a few scattered belongings. Old blankets lay piled together, and a few personal items were strewn about. Whose camp is this? Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, but it looks abandoned, Scott replied, stepping closer to inspect the area. There might be something here that can help us. As they sifted through the belongings, Scott's heart raced. He found a half-burnt notebook, its pages singed at the edges but still legible. Flipping through it, he discovered entries filled with hastily scrawled thoughts, an account of someone's life, perhaps a camper who had visited the area. Then, one entry stood out, written in frantic handwriting. I can't trust him anymore. I saw him with her, and now I'm scared. I have to leave this place. "Tom, look at this," Scott said, showing him the page. "What does this mean?" Tom's expression darkened. "I don't know, but it sounds like someone was in danger. This could be related to Emily." Scott felt a surge of urgency. "We need to find out who wrote this. There has to be more to this camp." As they continued to search, Scott found remnants of a torn backpack and a jacket with a name tag, a name he recognized from the articles. "This was the other missing person," he said, holding up the jacket. "There were 2 disappearances." "Then we have to figure out how they're connected," Tom said, determination in his eyes. The gravity of their discoveries pressed down on them like a storm cloud threatening to burst. As they gathered their findings, Scott felt a sense of urgency wash over him. They needed to report their discoveries, but first, he wanted to explore the camp further. "Let's check the area one last time before we leave," Scott suggested, glancing around the clearing. As they searched, Tom found a small, hidden compartment beneath a pile of leaves. "Scott, come here, there's something here." Scott rushed over, and together they pulled the leaves aside to reveal a weathered box. Inside, they discovered a collection of personal items, pictures, letters, and trinkets. Among them, Scott recognized Emily's handwriting. "Tom, look," he exclaimed, holding up a letter addressed to him. "This is her." Tom's eyes widened as he took the letter, his hands trembling. "What does it say?" Scott watched as Tom read the letter silently, his expression shifting from confusion to sorrow. "She was scared, Scott. She mentioned someone threatening her. This is why she wanted to go to Cedar Grove." The revelation hit Scott hard. This means there was a real danger. She wasn't just lost. She was being pursued. As the weight of their discoveries settled in, Scott felt a renewed sense of purpose. They needed to honor Emily's memory, to fight for the truth she had sought so desperately. "Let's get this back to town," Scott said, determination in his voice. "We have to make sure this gets the attention it deserves." As they made their way back through the forest, the weight of their discoveries pressed down on them, but there was also a sense of hope. They were no longer just uncovering the past. They were piecing together a story that needed to be told. When they reached Scott's truck, he took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Tom, I appreciate you being here. We can't let Emily's story fade away." Tom nodded solemnly. "She deserves justice. We owe it to her." As they drove back to Pine Hollow, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Scott felt a sense of determination wash over him. He had found pieces of Emily's story, and now it was time to bring it to light. Once back in town, they headed straight to the sheriff's office. The urgency in their hearts propelled them forward as they recounted their discoveries. The sheriff listened intently, his expression serious. "This is significant," he said, taking notes. "We need to follow up on these leads immediately." Scott felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this time they would finally uncover the truth. As they left the sheriff's office, Tom looked at Scott, his face filled with gratitude. "Thank you for doing this. Emily deserves to be remembered." Scott nodded, knowing that they were just beginning their journey. With newfound resolve, he understood that uncovering the truth was just the first step. They would fight to honor Emily's memory, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. Underneath the surface of the small town, the pulse of life continued, a network of interconnected lives waiting for someone to listen. And Scott was determined to be that someone, to ensure the truth would finally emerge from the shadows. The sun hung low in the sky as Scott and Tom entered the sheriff's office, a sense of urgency propelling them forward. Sheriff Anderson, a stocky man with a graying beard and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from his desk, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "What can I do for you boys?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Scott exchanged a quick glance with Tom before speaking. "Sheriff, We found some important evidence regarding Emily Carter's case. We need to talk." The sheriff's expression shifted, attention sharpening. "Go on." Tom placed the silver locket on the desk, the metal gleaming in the overhead light. "We found this in an old cabin at Cedar Grove. It belonged to Emily." The sheriff picked it up, examining it closely. "This is significant. Have you been back to Cedar Grove?" "Yes, we found a campsite and some belongings that could relate to both Emily and another missing person," Scott said, his heart racing. "There was a notebook with a note that mentioned someone feeling threatened. It seemed urgent." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "Do you have the notebook?" "Yeah, we do," Tom replied, pulling it from his bag. He handed it over, feeling the weight of its contents. "There's more. It suggests that Emily was in danger and possibly being followed." Sheriff Anderson studied the pages, his expression darkening. "I'll need to bring this to the attention of the state authorities. If there's a connection to another missing person, this could be bigger than we thought." "Can you do something?" Scott asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "We need to make sure this gets the priority it deserves." "I'll do what I can," the sheriff assured them, placing the notebook on his desk. "In the meantime, I need you both to stay close. There might be more to uncover, and it's not safe to go back to Cedar Grove alone." Scott felt a rush of anxiety but nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll be careful." As they left the sheriff's office, Tom turned to Scott, his expression serious. "What do we do now?" "We need to dig deeper," Scott replied, determination hardening his resolve. "There must be more information about Emily and the other missing person. We can't let this go." The two decided to visit the local newspaper office, hoping to find old articles that could shed light on the past. The office was quiet, the air thick with the smell of ink and paper. The editor, a middle-aged woman named Clara, greeted them. "Scott, Tom, what brings you here?" she asked, noticing the urgency in their expressions. "We need to look into the archives," Scott said. "Specifically, anything related to Emily Carter and the other missing person." Clara nodded, leading them to a back room filled with filing cabinets. "I can help you search. Just give me a moment." As they sifted through the old articles, Scott's heart raced. Each page turned felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth. After some time, Clara pulled an article from a stack, her expression serious. "Look at this," she said, laying it out on the table. "It's from the week after Emily went missing. There was a witness who claimed to have seen her with a man near Cedar Grove." Tom leaned in, reading the details. "This could be crucial. Did they ever identify him?" "Not that I could find," Clara replied, frowning, "but the description was vague. A man with dark hair and a green jacket. It could fit anyone." Scott felt a flicker of hope. "But it's a lead. We need to find out if anyone else witnessed anything." Clara nodded. "I'll publish a call for information in the next issue. Maybe it will jog someone's memory." "Thank you, Clara. We appreciate it," Tom said, gratitude evident in his voice. As they left the newspaper office, the weight of their discoveries pressed down on them. Each new piece of information felt like a step closer to revealing the truth. But with each step, the danger of the past felt closer too. That evening, they reconvened at Scott's house, spreading their findings across the table. The locket, the notebook and the articles formed a mosaic of Emily's life, a life cut short, a story left untold. "I think we need to get in touch with Sarah again," Scott said, his mind racing. "She might have more insight into Emily's life, especially if she knew about any threats." Tom nodded. "You're right. We should try to find her before anything else happens." Scott reached for his phone, dialing Sarah's number. After a few rings, she picked up. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's Scott." "We need to talk about Emily," he said, urgency threading through his voice. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern evident. "We've found some clues that suggest Emily was in danger before she disappeared. We need your help to understand more about her life," Scott replied. There was a pause on the other end before Sarah spoke again. "I'll meet you at the diner. Give me 20 minutes." They arrived at the diner, the familiar sounds of clanking plates and murmured conversations filling the air. When Sarah walked in, her expression was serious. "What's going on?" she asked, taking a seat across from them. Scott quickly recounted their findings: the locket, the notebook, the articles. "We believe Emily was in danger, possibly being followed. Do you remember anything that might help us?" Sarah's expression shifted, concern deepening. She had been acting different before she disappeared, more withdrawn. She mentioned feeling uneasy, but I didn't realize it was serious. "Did she say anything about someone following her, or any specific incidents?" Tom pressed. Sarah shook her head. "No, but she did mention having an argument with Tom. I thought it was just relationship drama, but looking back, it seems like more." Scott felt a jolt of realization. So she was already feeling isolated, even from Tom. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had taken her seriously. I should have been there for her." "None of this is your fault," Tom reassured her. "We're trying to find the truth and bring closure." Scott leaned in, urgency clear in his voice. "Is there anything else you can remember? Any details about her life that might help us?" Sarah took a deep breath, appearing lost in thought. "There was this one time. She mentioned a friend from college who had a dark reputation. I didn't think much of it then, but she seemed worried." "Do you remember his name?" Scott asked. "No, but she said he was in town for a while. I had a bad feeling about him," Sarah replied, frustration evident in her voice. "We need to find out who he is," Tom said, determination solidifying in his expression. "If he was in town at the time, he might know something." After wrapping up their conversation, they promised Sarah they would keep her updated. Scott and Tom left the diner, a sense of urgency propelling them forward. "Let's check with some of Emily's old college friends," Scott suggested. "They might remember this guy." They spent the next few days making calls and visiting social media pages, piecing together a web of connections. Finally, they managed to track down a friend of Emily's from college, a woman named Jessie, who had stayed in touch. Meeting up at a coffee shop, they shared their findings with her. Jessie listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember that guy," she said, her voice steady. "His name was Jake. He was always a bit off, you know, a wild card. Emily was worried about him. She said he was unpredictable." "Did anything happen between them?" Tom asked, leaning forward. Jessie shook her head. "Not really. She cut ties with him before she graduated, but he would show up unexpectedly at times. I don't know why she kept him around." "Do you know where he is now?" Scott pressed, feeling the pieces starting to fall into place. "Last I heard, he was living in a nearby city. I can try to reach out to some mutual friends. Maybe they'll have updated information," Jessie offered. "Thanks, Jessie. That would help a lot," Scott said, gratitude in his voice. As they prepared to leave, Jessie's expression darkened. "Be careful. If Jake was still interested in Emily and she wanted nothing to do with him, he might be dangerous." The warning hung in the air as Scott and Tom exchanged worried glances. They were now navigating a path filled with shadows, and the danger felt all too real. With newfound urgency, they set out to uncover more about Jake and his connection to Emily. Each lead felt like a thread connecting the past to the present, pulling them closer to discovering the truth. As they approached Jake's last known address, Scott felt a mix of apprehension and determination. They were stepping into the unknown, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. The echoes of Emily's story resonated within them, pushing them to seek justice for the woman who had captured their hearts. Together, they would unravel the threads of the past, determined to shine a light on the darkness that had overshadowed Pine Hollow for far too long. The sun hung low as Scott and Tom approached the address they had tracked down for Jake. It was a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the nearby city, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in, creating a feeling of isolation. Scott felt a knot form in his stomach, a mix of dread and determination. "Are you ready for this?" Tom asked, glancing over at Scott. "We have to do this. We need answers," Scott replied, steeling himself for what lay ahead. They parked the truck and made their way toward the entrance, the sound of their footsteps muted by the thick carpet of grass. As they stepped inside, the dimly lit hallway stretched before them, lined with faded wallpaper and flickering lights. Scott felt the weight of their purpose as they approached Jake's apartment door, number 3B. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the silence. For a moment they stood there, hearts pounding, waiting for a response. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a disheveled man in his 30s. Jake's dark hair hung over his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice rough and guarded. "Are you Jake?" Scott asked, trying to keep his tone steady. "Yeah, who's asking?" Jake replied, crossing his arms defensively. "Scott and Tom, we're looking into the disappearance of Emily Carter," Scott said, watching for any signs of recognition in Jake's expression. At the mention of Emily's name, Jake's face paled slightly. "What about her?" "We found some evidence that suggests she was in danger before she went missing," Tom interjected. "We believe you might have some information that could help us." Jake hesitated, glancing back into his apartment, as if weighing his options. The tension in the air was palpable. "I don't know anything," he finally said, a nervous edge in his voice. "Please, we're just trying to find out what happened," Scott pressed, desperation creeping into his tone. "Emily was our friend. She deserves justice." Jake's eyes darted around, and he finally sighed, stepping back to let them in. "Fine, but I'm not sure what I can tell you." They entered the small, cluttered apartment, the air thick with a mix of stale smoke and unwashed clothes. Scott and Tom exchanged glances, sensing Jake's unease. "Just tell us what you know," Scott urged, sitting down on the edge of a worn couch. Jake ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "I knew Emily from college. We hung out a few times, but she wasn't the type to keep people close. When she started dating Tom, I backed off. I didn't want to complicate things." "Did you ever see her with anyone else? Anyone who seemed off?" Tom asked, leaning in closer. "There was one guy, someone she mentioned once or twice. He came around when she was alone. I didn't get a good look at him, but I could tell she was uncomfortable," Jake replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She didn't want to talk about him." "Do you remember his name?" Scott asked, urgency rising within him. "No," she never said, "but she seemed scared of him. I thought it was just a phase, you know. Girls get paranoid sometimes." Scott felt frustration building. "This isn't just paranoia, Jake. This is about Emily's life." "Look, I didn't see anything. I was just a guy who knew her from a distance," Jake said, defensiveness creeping into his tone. "Then why did you keep showing up?" Tom challenged, his voice rising. "I told you. I backed off. I didn't want to interfere." Jake snapped back, his temper flaring. "She was better off without me." "Maybe," Scott said, keeping his voice steady. "But you have to understand, every detail counts. If you remember anything, even a small detail, it might help us." Jake looked conflicted, his eyes drifting around the room. Finally, he seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping. "All right, fine. There was a night when she called me. She sounded scared. Said someone was following her. I didn't take it seriously at first, but now I wonder if I should have." Scott leaned forward, his heart racing. "What did she say?" "She just wanted to talk. It was late, and I was with friends. I told her I'd call back, but I never did. I thought she was overreacting. I never thought—" His voice trailed off, regret flooding his features. "Jake, we need to know if you remember anything else about that night," Tom urged. "Just that she was panicking." "I told her to go to the police," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "But what if she didn't? What if she was too scared?" The realization hit Scott hard. If she was being followed, she might have been afraid to go to the police. "I'm sorry, man, I really am. I didn't know," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Do you remember anything about the guy she mentioned? Any details?" Scott pressed, desperation creeping into his tone. Jake shook his head. "Just that she was worried. I think he had dark hair, maybe a green jacket. I didn't see him, I swear. But if someone was following her, that's not good," he said, looking genuinely distressed. Scott exchanged a glance with Tom, feeling a surge of urgency. "We have to find this guy. If he was involved in her disappearance, we need to know." Jake gulped, fear flashing across his face. "Listen, I don't want to get involved. I've been trying to forget," he said, his voice quaking. "Then help us find closure for Emily. If this guy is still around, he could be a threat to others," Tom said firmly, not backing down. Jake looked conflicted, his gaze darting to the window as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't know how much help I can be." "You can start by telling us everything you know," Scott said, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but then sighed, defeated. "I'll try. I wish I had been more of a friend. I wish I had done more for her." "Help us do something now," Tom urged, leaning closer. "We can't let her memory fade." As they continued to talk, Scott felt a mix of frustration and determination. They were piecing together a puzzle, and with each new fragment, they moved closer to the truth. Finally, Jake mentioned a name that made Scott's heart race. "I remember her mentioning an old friend from college who had a bit of a reputation. I think his name was Jake, too. He showed up at random times, and she was always on edge when he was around." "Do you have any idea where we can find him?" Tom asked quickly. "I think he was living in the city for a while, but I haven't seen him in years," Jake replied, glancing away. "Do you remember anything else? Any details that could help us track him down?" Scott pressed, leaning in closer. "Just that he was strange. He had a way of making people uncomfortable." "I never understood why Emily kept talking to him," Jake said, his voice trailing off. "We need to find him," Scott said, determination burning in his chest. "If he's linked to Emily's disappearance, we have to confront him." "Be careful," Jake warned, his face pale. "If he was bad news, then who knows what he's capable of now?" "We will," Tom assured him, tension thick in the air. As they left Jake's apartment, Scott felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The pieces were fitting together, but the picture was still murky, clouded by fear and uncertainty. "Let's find out who this guy is," Tom said, determination evident in his eyes. "We need to see if he's still in the area." "Agreed," Scott replied, the urgency propelling them forward. "We have to follow this lead." They spent the next few days digging through college connections, social media, and old alumni records, determined to track down any trace of Jake's old friend. As they pieced together the timeline and connections, they felt the pressure building. Finally, they found an address linked to him in a neighboring city. It wasn't far, and the urgency propelled them to make plans to visit. As they drove to the address, Scott felt his heart pounding, anticipation building with each mile. They were now on the brink of uncovering something significant, and he knew they had to be ready for whatever awaited them. Pulling up to a modest apartment building, Scott turned to Tom. "This is it. Are you ready?" "Let's do this," Tom replied, determination etched into his features. Together, they stepped out of the truck, hearts racing as they approached the entrance. With every step, they felt the weight of Emily's story urging them forward, driving them to seek justice for a life that had been cut short. Scott and Tom approached the modest apartment building on the outskirts of the nearby city, a sense of foreboding hanging in the air. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the atmosphere felt thick with anticipation. They exchanged a determined glance before stepping inside. As they ascended the staircase to the second floor, Scott felt his heart race. They were about to confront someone who might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Emily. The hallway, dimly lit, was lined with peeling wallpaper. Each step felt heavier, weighed down by the gravity of their mission. Arriving at apartment 2C, Scott raised his hand to knock. "You ready?" "Yeah, let's do this," Tom replied, his voice steady. Scott knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. After a moment, they heard muffled footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing a tall man with dark hair and a scruffy beard. "Can I help you?" he asked, his demeanor cautious. "Are you Jake?" Scott asked. "Yeah, that's me. What do you want?" Jake replied, crossing his arms defensively. "We're looking into the disappearance of Emily Carter," Tom interjected. "We need to ask you some questions." At the mention of Emily's name, Jake's demeanor shifted. "Emily? I haven't heard that name in a long time." "Do you remember her?" Scott pressed. "Of course," Jake said, his voice softening. "We went to college together." "But I don't know anything about her disappearance. Is that true?" Tom challenged, leaning in closer. "Because we've heard some things that suggest you might know more than you're letting on." Jake hesitated, the wariness in his eyes returning. "What have you heard?" Scott stepped forward, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "We found evidence suggesting Emily was in danger before she went missing. Someone might have been following her. We need to know if you were involved." Jake's expression shifted from wariness to concern. "I wasn't following her, I swear," he exclaimed, raising his hands defensively. "I hadn't seen her in months when she disappeared." "Then why did she mention being scared of someone close to her?" Tom pressed. "Every detail counts." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I never meant to hurt her. I was dealing with my own stuff back then. I didn't realize she was in trouble." "Where were you the night she went missing?" Tom asked sharply. "I was out of town on business, I can prove it," Jake replied, his voice pleading. "I didn't come back until days later." Scott felt torn. Jake seemed genuine, but also guarded. "If you can prove you were gone, that would help your case," he said, softening his tone. Jake nodded, relief washing over his face. "I can show you my travel receipts. I kept them for expense purposes." "Can you show us?" Tom asked. "Yeah, just give me a minute," Jake said, moving quickly to a cluttered desk. As he rifled through papers, Scott and Tom exchanged glances, both feeling the weight of uncertainty in the air. Jake returned moments later, holding a stack of papers. "Here's the proof. I was in the city for a conference. I didn't even know she was missing until I got back." Scott scanned through the receipts, seeing the hotel and flight information. "This looks legitimate," he admitted, feeling a mixture of frustration and relief. "Can you think of anyone who might have been around her frequently?" Tom asked, hoping to unearth more information. "There was a guy from her past. A friend, I think. He showed up a few times, but I didn't know him well. She seemed uncomfortable around him," Jake said, his brow furrowing. "Do you remember his name?" Scott pressed. "I think it was something like Eric or Ethan," Jake replied, shaking his head. "Then we need to find this guy," Tom said, determination in his eyes. "If he was a threat to Emily, we need to know." I can try to reach out to mutual friends who might know more, Jake offered, the tension easing slightly. Please do, Scott said, feeling a flicker of hope. Every detail matters. As they wrapped up their conversation, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of uncovering something significant. They had to follow this lead, no matter where it took them. Leaving the apartment, Scott and Tom climbed back into the truck, their minds racing with possibilities. We need to check social media for any leads on this Eric or Ethan, Scott suggested. Agreed, Tom replied, determination evident in his eyes. I have a feeling we're getting closer. As they drove home, the weight of the mystery loomed heavy, but Scott felt a sense of purpose. They were unraveling the threads of Emily's life, pulling at the strands that had been tangled for too long. Together, they would bring her story to light, ensuring that her voice would not be silenced any longer. Scott and Tom spent the following days immersed in their investigation, fueled by a mix of hope and urgency. They scoured social media and reached out to mutual friends, piecing together fragments of Emily's life. Each new detail felt like a thread, leading them closer to the truth. As they gathered information about Eric, they learned he had been a shadowy figure in Emily's life, someone who left her feeling uneasy. An old college friend described Eric as possessing a volatile personality, often acting possessively. This revelation intensified Scott and Tom's resolve to find him. One evening, while reviewing their findings at Scott's house, Tom leaned back in his chair, frustration etched across his face. I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something. Every time we think we're close, it slips away. Scott nodded, his own frustration mounting. I know, but we can't give up. We're on the right track. We just need to find Eric. Just then, Scott's phone buzzed with a notification. A message from Jesse, the college friend, flashed on the screen. I found Eric's new address. He's living in a nearby city. We need to find him before it's too late. Finally, Tom exclaimed, leaning in. Let's see what she sent. Scott opened the message, adrenaline coursing through him. We could head out there tomorrow. If we confront him, we might finally get answers. The next morning, they set out early, the sun barely rising as they drove toward the address Jesse had provided. The landscape blurred past, but Scott could only focus on the urgency of their mission. When they arrived at the apartment complex, it looked unassuming, just another building among many. But to Scott, it felt like a threshold between uncertainty and revelation. Ready? Tom asked, glancing at Scott. Yeah. Let's do this, Scott replied. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, the air thick with anticipation. Scott knocked on the door of apartment 4A, his heart racing. Moments later, a voice from inside called out, Who is it? Eric, we need to talk, Scott shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. The door creaked open, revealing a tall man with disheveled hair. What do you want? Eric asked warily. We're looking for information about Emily Carter, Scott said, watching for any flicker of recognition. At the mention of her name, Eric's face hardened. I don't know anything about that. Don't lie to us, Tom said, stepping forward. We know you were close to her. We need to know what happened. Eric hesitated, fear flashing across his features. I didn't do anything, he insisted, but his eyes betrayed him. Then help us understand, Scott urged. If you cared about her at all, you'll talk to us. Eric shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, he mumbled. She was just scared of me. Scott leaned in closer. What do you mean? Why was she scared? Things got out of hand. I just wanted to make sure she was safe, Eric confessed, his bravado fading. Did you threaten her? Tom pressed, sensing they were on the brink of a breakthrough. Eric's hesitation hung in the air, a storm of emotions clouding his face. I never meant to hurt her, he finally said, his voice cracking, but she pushed me away, and I didn't know how to reach her. As he spoke, Scott felt a mix of anger and empathy. They were on the verge of uncovering the truth that could finally bring justice for Emily. "Tell us everything," Scott demanded, determined to get to the bottom of this. "We need to know what really happened."